You're listening to Roleplay Geeks podcast, February 3rd, 2020. This is episode 1, and we're going to talk a little bit about sandbox versus story. Welcome to Roleplay Geeks podcast. This is Frank.
And this is Jim.
And today we talk about a topic that I think strongly delineates an approach to gaming. All right, and this is probably from the GM, the game master, or the dungeon master, depending on your particular system, how they think about it. But it does affect the players a lot, which is sandbox games versus story-driven games.
Yeah, so I think what we probably should do first is clearly define our terms. So let's talk first for those people who might not know what a sandbox game is, and then define what that would be in the context of the discussion, and then turn over to what we think a story-driven game would be, how we deal with the problems that come up depending on which approach you take.
Yeah, so let's talk about sandbox games, because I think story games are something the name kind of tells you. There's a story. You know, right. It has implications. I mean, we'll talk about that. It does have implications, but essentially you as the person running the game set up a story, and a story, like every story you've ever seen or read or whatever, has a beginning and has a middle and has an end. It has a protagonist and an antagonist and has characters and has plot and has high points and low points, and you kind of have to hit the story points along the way for the story to make sense. So if you start telling the story of Pinocchio and you jump to the story of Blade Runner, I mean, it's gonna be weird.
That could be fun, though.
It could be fun, but it's tricky. I mean, you've got an arc that weaves its way through. So that's essentially a story.
Who would Pinocchio be in Blade Runner?
I don't know. I just threw that out there, and I'm now regretting it. Because I can see the wheels in your mind are just thinking.
I'm thinking Rutger Hauer as Pinocchio.
I know. It could be, what's her name? Does the flips? Yeah. That's the story approach, and it's probably how most people are used to enjoying fiction.
So I think about it as the game master's telling the story to the players and not giving the players a lot of room to move around if you're talking about the extreme side of a storytelling role-playing game.
Yeah, and typically that's been associated with something called rails. So it's on rails. So you're going to start at point A, and no matter what game you're talking about, you're always going to start at point A. Whether it's a sandbox or whatever, because you have to start somewhere, right? And you know the trope way to do it is you're in a tavern and you meet and you're having drinks and then things happen and this gets you to go do stuff. So that would be point A, and then there's going to be another point B along the story, and there may be 87 points, it may be 3 points, it doesn't matter, but there's a next point. And in a Rails game, a story game, you're kind of forced to go that way. Even if you don't want to. If you're thinking to yourself, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to take up medieval agricultural farming.
And that might not be the direction the game master sees the game going, or the other players that hope.
Right. And so they may go, no, hard pass. But
unless you're from, the Midwest.
Yeah, you never. I mean, no judgments if that's what you're into. But the point is that may be what you're thinking, but that would be very, I don't even want to call it a tangent. It would just be like a random vector off of this plot line. Probably. I can't imagine many stories that are about agricultural farming and medieval. And I'm assuming D&D. If it's even worse if it's something that's science fiction based.
Yeah, it's hard to farm in space.
Yeah. But the point is that the thing that you need to do may not fit within the context of the story. So the game master is going to push you along rails to the next point in the story.
And then the sandbox game?
So yeah, the sandbox game, I'm not sure this term existed when we were younger. The concept certainly, but the term sandbox, I think it's something that comes out of video games, and I think we're relatively familiar with this concept in video games if you play them, but essentially I construct a world, and that world has many moving parts, and those parts move irrespective of what any player is doing in the world. So there are people going about their job and living their life and doing these things, and there's economies, and there's physics, and there's drama happening, and there's players, and there's non-players, but there are actors out there doing things, and that's going to happen if you just sit there and watch it, if you don't engage in it. And so the notion is that you, as a player, determine what you want to do in the world. You set your own agenda, your own set of goals, and you can kind of do whatever you want. So if you do want to do medieval agricultural farming. It's in the context because, in theory, the sandbox is big enough or deep enough to allow for that.
Right. So the starting point really is there is no story predefined. You just dropping the players in and then letting the players actually start the story, and then you respond to them as the game master, and the story sort of organically evolves out of that.
Yeah, if you're a programmer, this is a little bit like Lisp or something, as opposed to scheme, as opposed to like functional programming where you've got a point. The more narrative approach.
Yeah, it could be maddening because there's a lot of curly braces in there.
Yeah, so there's actually in game theory, not game theory in the sort of political sciencey who comes out on top, but in the theory of games, there's these two concepts. One is called narrativism, which is narratives drive a game. The other one's called ludology, which is ludo is Greek, I think, or Latin, I can't remember which, for game, and ology, study of. And it really talks about the mechanics. So in video games, we can talk about this very easily. If you think of a game like Tetris, there's no story there. It's just the mechanics of turning the blocks and getting them in line. That would be strong ludology. Whereas narrativism would be a game like Myst, where it's essentially, I show my age there with that game, right? With Myst, where it's essentially just a story, and you're sort of working your way through the story. So there's a sort of the stream poles, and most people acknowledge that the reality is that most games and video games are a mix of the two. And they may emphasize one over the other a little bit, but reality is you need a little bit of both. So Sandbox would be much more like ludology. It's just, I create a world, you move within it.
Yeah, so I think that pretty much covers
definitions.
Our extremes.
Yeah.
So what do you prefer as a game master?
Well, okay, so there's just two questions, right? What do I prefer as a game master, and what do I prefer as a player?
Right.
And the thing is that as a game master, I think it's really hard for me to write a narrative that doesn't ride on rails. Because I don't want to say I'm very good. I feel comfortable writing a story, and I know what those beats are. But I don't feel that my players know what those beats are very well. And they rarely hit any of them. So it's the only way I can get them to do that is if I force it, which I don't think is enjoyable for me because I don't think it's as enjoyable for them personally. So I prefer Sandbox so that I can create a structure under which people can operate. But I also think I suck at it more. So I'm more comfortable writing the story, but I think I'd probably run a Sandbox better. So it's a hard question to answer, really. What about you?
Well, as a game master, I lean toward the story, and I agree. The challenges to keeping the players on the rails for your story without making it seem forced is probably the biggest challenge. So, for example, if I had the players come into a town and I was going to start my story off with them meeting a farmer at a bar, and the farmer's like, my goat's gone missing. Well, some players are going to go, okay, that's the story. I'm going to just go ahead and follow it and follow where this goat went. And other people are going to be like, it's a goat. It's a farmer. There's no adventure.
Yeah, here's a couple of gold pieces. Leave me alone.
Exactly. So in that case, if that's my hook, that's not a very strong hook. And if I use it, maybe on the fly, I'll change it so it's no longer a goat. It would be a child. So my child's gone missing. Maybe they follow that hook. Maybe they don't.
It's a good point. Is that you have to know your players. I think it would be really hard to play with a new group that you don't know because you don't know how tied they are to moral ambiguity.
Yeah, what are their motivations?
Yeah, and so I'm very upfront. If you have got an evil or a morally ambiguous character, I'm not your GM. I'm not good. I don't understand how to motivate those characters.
I have to agree.
So it's really hard for me. And so if you want to go, if you want to pay, to go we've been using a lot of D&D terms, so I guess we'll continue with that. But if you want to go with an alignment that's in the, chaotic-y or more evil range, I don't know what to do with you. It's a limitation on my part, but I can't help you. So I'm going to give you something where you can be heroic, and I'm going to assume that you're going to choose to be heroic. And oftentimes that's not true.
Yeah, I think with the chaotic characters, at the very beginning of the game, you put it on the player to define what their goal in the world is. Then they have some fundamental goal that they're trying to achieve, like maybe the destruction of a church that they oppose or something along those lines. And then you fit the game so that they can be motivated to follow the game because that helps them achieve that goal.
Yeah, and I think that one other challenge there is that even if you understand what the players, what the character sheet says, right? You can look at the character sheet and you can say, well, you've got this and you got that stat and you have these skills, and therefore your motivation is clearly boom. But then the player may look at that and get a completely different interpretation of that character. And that can be really challenging because you're thinking, well, this person's going to want to do these things, so I'm going to put these elements in there that's going to excite them or find them interesting. And then they don't respond, and then you're like, I don't understand why that didn't work. And it's because their conceptualization of the character is different. And this is a real problem for me as a player, is my conceptualization of my character changes. So we just started a campaign in theory, and what I thought of when I made my character and what I think of when I start playing my character may be divergent. Like what I think of the person.
With you, it's almost always divergent.
So, and it's because as a player, you want to try different things, right? And so you're thinking, I'm thinking this, but then you'll interact with something, hear a song or see a movie or something. You go, well, it'd be cool to do something like that. And you want to bring that into your character, and that's cool. But the problem is that from a GM standpoint, that's very challenging because you're assuming one set of motivations that aren't there. So I think that makes Sandbox a lot more attractive, because really Sandbox is not about, in my opinion, is not about nailing what the characters will do. It's nailing how the world will react.
Yeah, and that seems a little bit more challenging to me than maybe a story-driven narrative, because you've got that story that you can rest on and always pulls you back and pulls the whole group back to like these points that you want to hit. Whereas with the Sandbox game, you're always you have to be on your toes almost at all times.
I think Sandbox works really well if you've been making a world for, a decade. Like if you have a world that you have fleshed out a lot, so you know what that's going to do. You know what the economy is. You know what this is. You know what that is. You know how this ruler is going to react to this thing happening, and you got some idea. And you can make a little story that fleshes out another bit, and you put it into your Wikipedia of your world or whatever.
Yeah, so for those 10-year-olds out there who are just getting into the game, that world that you've been building for 10 years probably has a lot of baby food and diapers in it.
But I mean, this is where it gets attractive, though. You take one of these like Forgotten Realms, right? That's a pre-canned world. So that's the cool thing. It's a pre-canned sandbox that you can just use. Well, how would this happen? I don't know. There's a source book you can read that'll tell you some of that. And that's, I think, pretty attractive because you can make interesting stories within that sandbox. The downside, of course, of something like that is that other people are doing it, including novels and things like that. And you get the player to go, well, in this chapter of this book, they did this. But if that's true, then you couldn't have done that.
Do you think modules are probably the perfect balance between a sandbox game and a story-driven game? Like if you get we did a module a while back. What was the name of that one that you ran us through?
Out of the Abyss.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is an interesting example, because this is a good example where sandbox will run away from you. So the module has, all right, so you start off in a prison, and then you work your way to the surface because it's all underground.
The Underdark.
Yeah, the Underdark. It's a D&D setting. It's in Forgotten Realms. And then what happens is that time passes, and you're supposed to do some things between there. And ideally, your characters are of level 8 or whatever it was before they go back under. And ours weren't. So I had to do some things. So I ran another little module that was kind of neat, and I liked it, which was fun. But it was a dungeon crawl. But I thought it was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was a good time.
And then, okay, we have these resources, and what are we going to do with it? Well, let's buy a trading company. Well, that's an interesting idea. Let's buy a trading company. I don't really know what that would do to the economy because I didn't work that out. I haven't worked out trade with who, trade what. Oh my God, I just made them trillionaires. How did that happen? I messed that up. I mean, I didn't think that stuff through well enough. And I kind of said, well, okay, now you got to go back into the module. And it did give me a way to bail out from the sandbox, but that I was truly screwing up. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Oh, but, so lazy.
Well, I mean, and it was the next thing to do. But the reality is that I kind of felt like that module was on rails, though, because the module had rails.
As a player, it sort of felt that way.
Yeah, and it's I find it. I've been playing with you guys for most of those 40 years. In one case, I have been playing with them for 40 years. Actually, I think I've been playing with you for like 37,
Something like that.
and then those guys 40. So I should be able to read, but I don't have a good read for that. I feel like as a GM that I'm always not doing well. I can't get a good sense for if anyone's having fun or they feel it's too much on rails or they don't know what to do or, these things. I think that's a really big challenge. And getting back to the topic, right? So the nice thing about a story is that if they're not hitting the next beat in a story, they don't know what to do. So you got to get them there. So you kind of do stuff to get them onto the next beat of the story. And that's kind of what you've got that outline. You've got that structure you can fall back on. Even if you let them sort of diverge off into a random tangent, you say, well, let me get you back. With the sandbox, you don't have that. But it actually can be kind of interesting, though, to not have that, because you can take things in different directions and allow people to explore aspects of gaming that are a little off the beaten path. So D&D, somebody we've been playing with a really long time doesn't like to play it. Playing games with a long time. He doesn't like to play it. He introduced us to a game called Traveler decades ago. And
my favorite game of all time.
Right. So, we all really like Traveler at some level, but, his name's Steve. Steve won't play. I don't think he's only played D&D with me once for like an hour.
The sailor.
Yeah. Right.
We won't go into that.
We won't get into that. But, so he just doesn't like D&D because he finds that it's boring and trope laden. So it's always about getting the gold or rescuing the princess or whatever it is. And so it's really difficult to write a story that doesn't fall into that trap. But it's really hard. The thing that's nice about a sandbox is you can let players write their own stories that don't fall into that trap, which can be cool.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have much to add there, really.
Well, I think, but it also puts you on the spot. You got to be really good at improvisation to do that. I think it's kind of interesting about Steve's case, because I think it's fair to say Steve's our favorite GM all in all.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah. And so he's really good at it. So he's the guy that, is the benchmark for us for play that way. He's really good at improvisation. He's really good at it.
He is, but at the same time, we know there's a story he wants to tell, so we're more inclined to go along with it.
Right. Well, I guess because he's good, also we're like, yeah, we'll hang. I mean, this is going to be worthwhile out of it. And I'm okay with that. But he's really good at improvising. And
keeping you on the story without you really realizing it. Like that improv that he does, he's forcing you to go back into his story, but it doesn't feel that way, just the way he presents it.
He's very good at subtly, and he's older than us, so it's over a lot more years than even we've been doing. So it's taken a long time for him to get to the skills, but it's pretty evident that he's tried to develop those skills. So
right, he's way, way, way older. He's got a grandson now.
He does. But the point being that developing that skill set takes a little bit of time. But what I was getting at is that I think it's kind of interesting. He doesn't run D&D at all because he's got the skills to not do the thing that irritates him most about D&D, more so than most.
That's true.
And it's just kind of interesting. He doesn't flex him in that way.
What do you do when a player sort of deviates from the story and is adamant that he's just not going to go along with the rest of the group? By the way, you're usually that player when I'm the game master. Not so much anymore, but when we were younger, yeah.
Here's the really interesting bit about that is that I don't really know I'm doing that. So I don't know what that says about my perception of the story or about someone communicating the story to me. Most of the time, I'm not aware that I'm deviating. So we just did another one with another friend of ours, right? And he does almost, maybe the second or third time ever in our life that he's run a campaign. And he did a good job. I was enjoying the campaign. But it was pretty evident he was getting frustrated because we were not doing the thing that was the basis of the entire story.
Right. He would give us clues and hints to do something that was non-combat related, and our take always was
shoot it. Yeah. It's just, no, I'm not interested. It's a post-apocalyptic. There's guns and things like that. But I mean, it was an interesting little take on things, and we haven't finished it either. But it was a neat idea, and we just kept not doing it. Now, to get back to your question, I'm dodging your question because I don't have a good set of skills for that. Some nights, if I've had a frustrating day at work, I just metaphorically beat the shit out of my players until they do what I want. And I never feel good about it.
So as a game master, that's your approach.
Well, that's one. Sometimes if I'm, again, if I'm frustrated and I had bait at work and I'm not, whatever, sometimes that's what I do. And it's a terrible way to do it. It's the worst way I ever do anything. So that's not a good idea, but sometimes that's what I do. Sometimes I let the story evolve and then try to bring it back. And I'm not very good at that, but sometimes that works best by accident.
Yeah, that's probably for younger players to recognize that, and this is something both Frank and I recognized quite a while back, is that your job as the game master isn't to beat the players up. It's to provide a great, fun game for everybody. So that's your number one job. Now, one thing I've noticed about you, Frank, is when you're being contrary, it almost never is malicious. It's almost as if you have in your mind these cinematic scenes, like you have this idea of what your character is, what he would do in those situations, and then you go with that, and it might go contrary to what I, as a game master, one thing that I remember really clearly, I don't remember why, but there was this one...
Is this the one where I would keep one on the roof?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So this is okay. So what happened here was, you're right. I think about my character a lot, and I want to think about, well, how would this? I like role playing a role, and a whole nother podcast topic we'll talk about is the theater of mind versus the tactical and all that stuff, because that's a different way to think about it. When I'm very much in the cinematic and thinking about the character and what he will or won't do, and he's almost always a he. I don't think I've ever played a female character. Maybe I should someday. But that's always the motivations. And in that particular case, my character was tactically orientated, and I kept thinking going from the roof is a better tactical move than going in from the ground floor. And so I thought, I'll go from the roof, we'll meet in the middle. And of course, I was a lot younger then, and I hadn't GM'd nearly as much. And I now know I'm splitting the party, and it always sucks for a GM when you split the party. It's just a real pain, though. Just the mechanics of doing that, because someone is always bored because they're not involved.
Right. I think it's hard for the players too.
Yeah.
Because you can't split your time well. It's easier just if everybody's together.
It's just, and I was doing that essentially. And he kept coming up with more and more ridiculous ways for me not to be able to do that.
Was that Steve or me?
It was you.
Game master. I was the game master.
You were the game master, and you kept getting more and more ridiculous ways for that not to be true. And I kept thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. And I kept doing it a different way. And so it was an inadvertent battle of wills between the two of us, because neither of us were really experienced enough to understand what was going on here. Is that, okay, yeah, you could do that, and it may make sense, but the story really is downstairs, so stop. And I wasn't picking up the subtle clues that, okay, I should be downstairs, stop.
Or not so subtle clues.
Right.
I handled it poorly from a game master standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, but it was, so I think that's why it sticks out in both of us. That's why I immediately knew exactly what you were talking about, because it's a great example. And then I'll admit, at some point, it just got fun to poke the bear, but...
That's your go-to move.
Yeah.
So, poke the bear, because that's more fun than the game.
Yeah, so that was, I don't remember any of it. I don't remember what genre it was.
I don't either.
It was an incident. It was a good incident of handling Rails badly from a player standpoint and a GM standpoint. It was
agreed.
And it's a great. It should be taught in role playing game school as bad. It's what not to do. Yeah. If you did a workplace seminar series, that would be, they would stop the film there and they go, no, well, let's examine what went wrong.
How could this have been done better?
Yeah, it was all. But yeah, I'm not very good, to answer your question, I'm not very good at that. And I don't, as I get older and more experienced, I tend to want to let people, so when I'm teaching, one of my mentors, he has this great tactic that I love, and I use it now, which is I'll ask a question of a class. If you ask a question of a class, usually they'll just ignore you because they don't really want to answer the question. And if it's something you really need them to give you feedback and answer the question, that way you kind of know if they're getting it or not, you just stare at them until somebody will always cape 100% of the time. There's my free teaching advice to you. You can always just ask them a question and stare at them, because they should have some answer. And if they're not giving it, eventually somebody will cape and do it. I kind of do that somewhat, as I'm like, look, I can't make this any more obvious without saying, get your ass over here. That's the only way. I cannot make it any more obvious. I'll just stop really responding to the sandbox. The sandbox will have hit the edge, and it's not great, but that's what I do.
I don't think I've ever noticed you doing that. Maybe you have, and I
think I've done it. I think it's you. I don't doubt it. You get better at, this is where, like, Steve is very good at doing things. Like, I bet if we had him here talking about it, he would talk about where one of the things that's, if you hopefully you develop the skill to not let on when you're lost. It's like you're like a dad in a car going, yeah, I know where we're going. And you're thinking, I have no idea where we're at. So it's just kind of, I'll figure it out. I mean, so you develop that kind of confidence and ability over time. And I think that's one of the skills. So I can think of many times I'm like, oh, I don't really know what to do now here. I don't know what to make this more obvious, and I don't know what to do if they don't do it. But it ends up working itself out. So clearly that doesn't come through. And that's its own skill in its own way.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely a skill that you either get or you stop playing.
Yeah, I mean...
It's inevitable.
Well, so we have another friend who ran a game once, and I think... And he may be on this podcast at some point, but I think his game was probably the least successful for me as a player.
Which one was that?
I don't know if you remember this. Steve ran a game, different Steve. Steve ran a game.
Stephen Joan?
Yeah. Ran a game that was kind of fantasy laden, and it was really, unsurprisingly, given his thought process. He's kind of weird and esoteric, and I didn't quite get where he was going. I think he had a really interesting story. I think he had one of the most unique stories that I remember ever doing. But I also think that he's an English major, and so he's used to literature and thinking in text and subtext and subtext and things like that. And I think that if he had written that story, it would have been an amazing story. But I think as players, we just weren't good enough to do that, what he was sort of depicting. I think if we would have been more clued into the story.
I'm trying to remember which story that was. Was I in there?
Yeah, and it was, I'm trying to remember, it's been years ago now. So this has been maybe 10 years ago or something like that. So it's been a while.
What was the system?
It was a fantasy system, but I'm not entirely certain it wasn't a custom or something. Yeah, it could have been a custom system we used from time to time.
Rollmaster, rather. That's
no, it was way after that. So it would have been, and it was, we only had like one or maybe two sessions. And then I think he stopped for lack of a better thing. But it is an example where I think he likes playing better than running. Again, it's an interesting thought process, and the story is very intriguing, I think, when he does that stuff. But he's very creative. You can't fault that. But running that and thinking of that are not necessarily synonymous skills. And I think in some ways he would be benefited from a sandbox approach. Yeah. Because then you can kind of let your players do what they're capable of doing,
Yeah, he definitely leans more toward the sandbox approach as a player, just because he thinks outside of the box and likes trying different things. I'd heard stories that when he was younger, he would always try to put spells together in unusual ways to come up with combinations that would achieve these really bizarre outcomes.
Yeah, he likes thinking at things. He likes getting at things from the side, sort of kind of metaphorically. I mean, just sort of let's approach it from a different angle. What if we do it this? And it's an interesting way to approach things. But from a game master, you have to be able to. This is where. So let's talk a little bit about that. So we kind of presented sandbox and narrative as kind of dichotomous. You can do this or that, and reality is that you got to weave in and out of those two more often than not.
Yeah, it's almost always in the middle of those two, leaning one side or the other, but in the middle.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be parts that you've got a story, and you may have the overarching beats, but how they get from A to B, sandbox it, so they can kind of work their own way there. Here's the thing that people forget: is you're God and creator of the entire universe. So if you go, well, the topography means that the mountains are way over here and they're way over in the desert. Move the mountain. I mean, you could do that. They don't know.
That's a perfect description of how I approach game mastering.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, I'll just put this over here. And so that's what you want to do. And I think it makes it easier for people to feel like they have autonomy, have their own, the term they use in virtual reality, embodiment. You're embodied in the story. I made my decisions, and these are the functions of my outcomes. And I think that's what you have to do with Steve, and more than anybody else I've ever played with, is let him have his own agency. Let him go on his own. It's okay. He can do what he wants because he's going to curve over to here, even if he doesn't realize it, because you just move the point of impact so it is in his trajectory, whereas what he's doing isn't, the way you envision it. And you have to be able to do that, and you have to think on your feet. And that's challenging.
He is one of my favorite players. He is my favorite co-player. Like when I'm playing...
Oh, I hate it so much. The two of you are the worst. You
didn't like the murder bots?
You don't know how. Well, this is a good example of realizing you can sometimes riff to a place where you say, I can't work with this. And that was a great example. It was an interesting idea. It was a Star Wars based game, and they both independently of each other decided to make bots and the other guy droids.
Right.
And they essentially completely accidentally ended up making C-3PO and R2-D2 effectively. But then they decided it'd be more interesting to make them more morally ambiguous. And so
evil, I'd say.
Yeah.
I mean, painting the inside of your ship with Wookiee pelts.
Yeah, it was definitely evil. And then we've got a human player who wasn't, was trying to, but it was fun, and it was certainly, it will go. I think if we play for another 40 years, that will be, remember the time. That's going to stick around. So it's certainly memorable and it's successful in that regard. But definitely, we stopped playing that game because I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know as a GM what to do with that. I couldn't do anything with it. So I said, I'm not going to do this.
Some of the most fun times came out of that.
Yeah. But I didn't know what to do with it. And so you're stuck with two players who are having a lot of fun. And you're like, okay, great. I want you to have fun, but I'm lost. So, you have to figure out how to either take control of the reins or just say, this is wonderful. You enjoy that with somebody else. That's the only way you can do. And you don't feel bad, but sometimes that happens.
So at the end of the day, what do you think? What's the optimal state? Obviously, it's somewhere in the middle, but do you think it leans more toward the sandbox or toward the story?
I think it's more towards the sandbox.
See, I think it's more toward the story.
And here's why I think it's more towards the sandbox. If you have a well-developed sandbox, you can write almost any story.
That's true, but I think it's the story because if you have a story, you've clearly got the story in your mind, and you're able to hit those points. I mean, you let the sandbox dictate how you get to the points.
I can see that. I mean, you can't just have a sandbox. You have to have some mini stories, if nothing else. And I like the idea of having a sandbox in a perfect world. And I've never successfully made it. So I'll say this what I prefer, but I've never done it. Well, is having a sandbox that's robust enough, and then having a set of mini stories in your backpack that you can pull out and say, let's take a few mini stories and link them together. But the problem is that the interest and motivation for mini story A and mini story C don't necessarily match up, so you have to kludge them together, and it can get a bit difficult to pull off in a meaningful way. So I get having the overarching story. I mean, let's be honest. The perfect, in my opinion, role-playing game ever is the third season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And here's why I say that. You've got Sunnydale, which is a sandbox. And there's all these little mini episodes that are isolated from each other, and they're great little stories. But there's an overreaching story that goes the entire season, and it's all connected. And really, if you think about that as a role-playing game, that's the perfect approach because you've got your sandbox, which you've well worked out. You've got your overreaching story, but you've got the latitude to tell these little mini stories if people go in certain directions.
Yeah, that's a good one. Joss Whedon is really good at that. I think Firefly, for me, because I like space more, is a good representation of that. And The Expanse is magnificent. I love that show.
I like The Expanse, but I don't feel like it's a great story.
Yeah.
But I don't feel that it has that sandbox elements to it, really.
No, not so much. I think it's mainly a story. But it came out of a role-playing game, right? Yeah,
it did. Well, and so did Firefly. But I think Joss is a little more adept at and the source material for The Expanse is a very dense story, so there's a lot for them to link together and make a story. So there's a lot there. But I like the get back to the sort of the topic, because we could talk about The Expanse and Firefly for an hour. But I like the notion of having this room to play but overreaching story, and it's really hard to prep that, particularly as you get older.
So you don't have the time.
Yeah, it's like when you're a teenager and school's not that hard and you got time to do these things, but when you're older, you have all this life junk, and it gets a little harder. And that's why modules are actually really compelling. You said earlier that it's kind of the nice blend of that, and I think part of it's because somebody has made this story and somebody has made the sandbox, and you can kind of dip and weave around it. And I really do enjoy the reading of source material and utilizing it. I find that's kind of interesting. So even though Forgotten Realms is really played out, I do like reading the source books about it and using that stuff in my world, as it were. You're not having to worry about like, well, how come this country is here and why doesn't it have a problem with its neighbors? And though my favorite game I've ever run though is I Made Completely Myself, which is that one. It's been years. We ran where there was a prince and you got sent to move some message and you were supposed to be captured and all that stuff. It was a war between the orcs and the humans and it was a whole. I really enjoyed that sandbox and story.
Those first two adventures in that little world you created were a blast. I don't remember much after that because we have short attention span. So we tend to go into a couple of games and then after that we're like, oh, let's go play a space game or murder bots or something like that.
Right, and that can be a real problem. I think it would be, you see these news items of these people who've been playing the same game for 30 whatever years or whatever, and I'm like, that'd be really cool, but I don't even know how you would do that.
Right.
I don't even know how you would begin to approach that. But that's a separate topic.
For another day.
So, anywho, if you have any thoughts about this, feel free to contact us or leave us, comments or anything like that. This is an internal problem that every GM deals with at every level. So, and I don't think there's a right answer. You figure out what works for you and your players, and if everybody's happy, everybody's happy.
That sounds like a good way to wrap up.
Yep. So, and this is how we roll
with Jim and
Francois.